Hello, Professor. My name is Alex Bird, and I'm going to show you what I've learned this semester during my first semester of grad school. It's been great. Specifically, I learned about backwards design and understanding by design in that textbook. What I liked most about it was that it wasn't necessarily a new concept. I've heard it all around education before, but I didn't necessarily know what components or tools I needed to make it happen. So there's 3 steps to it. One is to identify the desired results, such as establishing your goals. And as we were learning, I was implementing it in my classes. As STAR has been approaching, it's been important to revisit goals through objectives, going higher on the blooms, no longer just identifying or just understanding, but truly synthesizing that information and letting the students know that that's what I'm doing when I'm writing the objectives and when we're setting our own numerical goals for a skill. Secondly, the second step would be to determine acceptable evidence, such as formative and summative assessments. And that's important because you should be assessing students in different ways. And I think just being intentional and planning for which ways you're going to assess them is very important. The third step would be to plan learning and instruction, which my first year of teaching, that part came most naturally. And I noticed as I've been talking to my peers that that's like usually the biggest focus. You have to really be intentional with the other steps to do those first and then do the third step, like literally third, so that you're not just doing activities and lessons in vain. So the next thing that I learned would have to be the twin sins. I thought that was an interesting title for that. Sin 1 being hands-on without minds-on. And I thought that was catchy and interesting. I think especially someone like me, gift of gab, enjoys talking with students and doing fun activities, but it can be harmful if we're just doing it in vain, like I mentioned before, and not with really a rhyme or reason, just because I just want to read this book. I notice that English teachers do that a lot. I can say that because I am an English teacher. We'll just want to read a text but not know the skills needed to teach. So I think it's important not to just do random activities because apparently that's sin number 1. So sin number 2 would be coverage, meaning that we're just going through content, through a scope and sequence, through just curriculum, mindlessly, and without really thinking it through. And sometimes the kids suffer because we're moving way too fast, or it's just not authentic teaching. The third term I would like to go over, or concept, will be the standards movement. And for some reason, I'm really obsessed with TEKS and standards. I think it's very interesting. I guess because I didn't really understand it fully as a student. So now as a teacher, I like to involve my students in all of that. So in theory, the standards provide a focus for curriculum and instruction. So that's theory, perfect scenario. But in practice, there's 3 problems that teachers run into. And so the first problem would be that there's an overloading problem. So when you have too many TEKS or standards for a unit, for a lesson, for a lot of things. Honestly, it took me until this year to truly understand how to unpack the TEKS and not to to have too much in my lesson to the point that that students aren't able to grasp all of that. If I have like five, for an example, if I have like 5 teaks in a day, there's no way I'm getting to 5 teaks. 1 or 2 tops. And some things are, already learned skills, but explicitly teaching certain standards, it should be limited and not overloaded. The second problem is the Goldilocks problem, which how the porridge was, too hot or too cold. In this case, it would be that some teaks are maybe one might be more complex than another. Another may be very short and simplistic. And so just knowing what's all needed to unpack the teak, and not just unpacking in terms of planning, but also implementing, because you're unpacking the skill for the students so that it can be attainable and they can ultimately master it. And then we have the third problem, which is the vague problem. And this is where a standard is very open for interpretation. And I think that I see this most like in PLC meetings with other teachers. We'll kind of like not debate, but deeply discuss teaks and how to best figure out the teaching points and those sorts of things. And it's not necessarily anyone's fault, because some of them are more open for interpretation. I think that just knowing this going forward, that is a pitfall of educators to not to interpret the teaks differently. I think it's important so that we can go forward and maybe have different ways of reaching the same goal, because it's a terminal objective. It's the final goal of mastery. Okay, so then in the other textbook, using technology with classroom instruction that works, there are 9 categories of instructional strategies. I'm a big strategy person. I think it really takes your teaching to a different level, because students, get tired of just writing notes and just lecture. And so I think it's awesome to kind of spice it up, but also have a reason for how you're teaching. So the most interesting one that I felt like was most in line with English language arts would be non-linguistic representations, especially for English language learners, which in essence all of them are, especially in 6th grade, but newcomers that are new to the country, or in the ESL program especially, I think that it's important for them to have an outlet of communication that may not be verbal or in writing, but they can still communicate what they're feeling when they're reading a text, and those sorts of things. Discussions that aren't necessarily verbal. So I'll give you an example. So for instance, I have 2 strategies here that I would like to discuss with you: movies and video. So there's 2 perspectives for this activity. One way you could do it is using it for instruction. So a way that I've done that is shown a brain pop video to build background on a topic, especially a complex one, kind of just in simplistic kid language, in a better way that I could explain it, right? Another way is to use it as instruction. And so initially, before reading that part of the book, I was thinking, okay, it replaces instruction, but I kept reading, and they want students to create the video. So it would be as a product. So I think that's good because as a third year teacher, sometimes I can get stuck with just me instead of letting the kids breathe and let them actually synthesize the information with kinesthetic, in kinesthetic ways. So the second instructional strategy that I want to mention, speaking of kinesthetic, is kinesthetic technology. And the book mentioned using like plastic recorders to make music, and I totally remember that, specifically like in third and fourth grade. And it was actually in the Houston area. And I remember it being so fun. I just felt like I was, so cool. And I guess that was kind of the musical technology at the time, or kind of what everyone was doing. So it kind of jogged my memory and made me think that every generation has their own type of technology and focus. And so this generation, they have a bunch of different devices. So phones, computers, tablets, all of those things. And I think it's important to incorporate it so that they feel understood, heard, and that you can even teach teachers something. So I didn't see that many examples of this, even though I really liked it and even though I want to incorporate it in my classroom, just because I know that my students love anime, they love video games. That's what they go home and absorb, obviously, after my homework is done. So I really want, going forward, I would like to find more examples. I did look up a few. Google SketchUp, which I think would be awesome, especially for my ELL learners, like I mentioned before. Just being able to also show them maybe a silent film. I've done a lot of those, like the Pixar shorts. Showing them that type of film and having them respond like with, like a quick draw. Usually I have them do it in their journal, but I think that just making that digital, like always thinking of a way to make it digital and more relatable, I think will make for a more fun classroom and more inclusive. So that is everything. I have loved this class. I appreciate your patience and information that you've given us in the articles and in the textbooks, suggesting those for the classroom. So thank you so much for everything. Thanks. Bye.